Nature allowed them to flourish in an environment rich in resources. Central to their lives were three key elements: boats, shell money, and acorns. Together, these elements formed the backbone of their culture, trade, and survival. The river journey. The morning mist hung low over the water as Kelia and her brother Tupa prepared their family's tomol, a sleek, redwood plank canoe, for a journey to the islands beyond the horizon. The tomol was a marvel of craftsmanship, its seams sealed with tar and its planks held tightly together by sinew and fiber. Kelia checked the bundles of dried fish and shell beads, valuable items they would trade with the islanders. Tupa, slightly older and brimming with excitement, adjusted the oars. "The sea looks calm today," he said, squinting at the distant waves. "It is a good day for travel," Kelia replied. "The islanders will be waiting for us. Let's hope we've brought enough shell money to trade." The siblings were part of the Chumash people, renowned for their mastery of the ocean and their tomol boats. Their journey was more than a simple trade mission. It was a celebration of a network that connected distant communities. From the mainland to the Channel Islands, their tomol glided over the waves, the rhythmic splash of oars mingling with the cries of gulls overhead. The currency of shells. Meanwhile, on the mainland, Elder Macca sat in the shade of a large oak tree, stringing together tiny beads carved from olivia shells. Each bead had to be drilled and polished, a task requiring precision and patience. The finished strings would be traded for obsidian tools, finely woven baskets, or rare animal hides from distant tribes. Macca paused, holding up a finished strand to inspect its uniformity. "This will fetch a fine price at the next gathering," she murmured. Her grandchildren, playing nearby, marveled at the shiny beads, their hues shifting from creamy white to iridescent lavender. For the coastal tribes, shell money was more than a medium of exchange. It was a symbol of connection and trust, binding communities in a vast trade network. Shell beads often traveled hundreds of miles inland, crossing the Sierra Nevada to reach desert tribes who valued them as highly as gold. The acorn harvest. In the foothills of the Sierras, where mighty oak trees dotted the landscape, another vital activity was underway. Naya and her mother, Parker, worked beneath a towering black oak, gathering acorns into woven baskets. The air was fragrant with the earthy smell of fallen leaves, and the distant sound of a river echoed through the forest. "This is a good harvest," Parker said, lifting a basket onto her hip. "The ancestors have blessed us with plenty." Naya nodded, her small hands deftly sorting the acorns, discarding those with holes or cracks. She knew the work was far from over. The acorns had to be shelled, pounded into a fine flour using a stone mortar and pestle, and then leached with water to remove the bitter tannins. Only then would they become the nutty, nutritious meal that sustained their people through the winter. Later that evening, the community gathered around a fire, sharing stories and songs as they enjoyed steaming bowls of acorn porridge. The elders spoke of how the oak trees were sacred, their bounty a gift to be cherished and preserved. A culture of balance. Boats, shell money, and acorns were not just tools for survival, they were the cornerstones of a sophisticated culture that thrived on balance and reciprocity. The tomol allowed tribes to explore, connect, and trade. Shell money wove an economic and social tapestry that spanned the region, while acorns provided sustenance and a deep spiritual connection to the land. In prehistoric California, these elements came together to form a way of life that was as enduring as the oak trees and as fluid as the rivers and seas. Through their ingenuity and respect for nature, the indigenous peoples of California created a thriving world that remains a testament to their resilience and wisdom. Prehistoric California. Boats, shell money, and acorns. Long before the rush of gold miners or the arrival of settlers, before the Spanish missions carved their crosses into the landscape, the California coast was alive with cultures that thrived for thousands of years. These early people, with their intricate relationship to the land and sea, shaped the region in ways that still echo today. In the heart of this world were three things that stood out: boats that danced across the ocean, shell money that held immense value, and acorns that sustained entire communities. It was a crisp morning at the edge of the California coast, the Pacific waves crashing against the shore. The scent of salt water hung in the air, blending with the earthy tones of oak trees and dry grasses. A small village perched on the rocky cliffs, where the land seemed to meet the sky, and a group of people gathered by the shoreline, preparing for the day's hunt. In the heart of the village, a young woman named Tala was sharpening her tools by the fire. Her hands were nimble, working on the delicate art of flint knapping, crafting arrowheads and knives from the sharp stone. Tala was part of the Chumash people, a group renowned not just for their skill with tools, but for their extraordinary craftsmanship in boat building. The Chumash were among the first peoples in California to master the art of boat making. Their tamols, slender dugout canoes, could glide across the waters with remarkable speed and agility. Carved from large logs of pine or redwood, the tamols were the lifeblood of the Chumash, carrying people to far-off islands where the best fishing grounds lay, and enabling trade with neighboring groups. As Tala finished her work, she walked down to the beach, where several of these boats were tethered. The sight of them, painted in intricate patterns, was a reminder of the Chumash's deep connection to the sea. Today, they would use the boats to venture out to the Channel Islands in search of abalone, a precious shellfish that was both a delicacy and a valuable trade commodity. Her cousin, Kimo, stood at the bow of one of the tamols, guiding it into the water. He was a skilled fisherman, known for his uncanny ability to navigate the often turbulent waters of the channel. Tala joined him, pushing another tamol into the surf. Soon, the boats were gliding across the water, cutting through the waves like graceful birds in flight. As they approached the islands, the coastline of the mainland growing distant, Tala marveled at the strength and craftsmanship of the boat beneath her. The Chumash had learned to read the water like few others, using the stars to navigate, understanding the winds and tides, and recognizing subtle signs in the waves. The ocean was both a provider and a protector, but it was also dangerous. Yet Tala felt at home on its vast expanse, as if the waves themselves were whispering secrets. After hours of fishing and gathering, they returned to shore, where their families eagerly awaited the day's catch. Abalone shells were prized not just for their meat but also for their iridescent beauty. The shells, when cleaned and polished, became highly coveted items, used in everything from adornment to ceremonial rituals. But it wasn't just the shellfish that held value. Tola's uncle, a respected elder, sat by the fire that evening, preparing a meal from the day's harvest. His withered hands held a string of small, round beads, shell money, a form of currency that had been used for centuries. The beads, made from the shells of marine snails, were carefully strung together into necklaces, belts, and other adornments, traded between tribes for goods and services. Shells are not just for eating or wearing, Tola's uncle explained. They are symbols of wealth, of abundance. With them, we can trade for things that we do not have: food, tools, even the services of a skilled craftsman. The shell beads were not the only form of currency in this world. Acorns, too, played an integral role in the daily life of many California tribes. The oak groves that dotted the landscape were a vital source of sustenance. The acorn, with its bitter taste, had to be leached to remove toxins, but once prepared, it could be ground into flour and used to make a wide variety of foods. It was said that one could live solely on acorns and thrive, as long as there was a way to process them. For the Chumash, the acorn was more than just food, it was a gift from the earth. Tola's family had long harvested acorns from the oak trees that grew near the village, using large, flat stones to grind them into a powder. The process was long and laborious, but the results were rewarding: acorn mush, acorn cakes, and even acorn bread that could last for months when dried. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Tola's family sat around the fire, sharing stories. Her uncle spoke of the old ways, of how the people had learned to live in harmony with the land and sea. The acorns, the boats, and the shells were all part of a greater cycle, a cycle of respect, stewardship, and exchange. "We are caretakers of this land," he said, his voice steady and calm. "The acorns grow in the oak trees, and the shells come from the sea. Our boats take us to places far and wide, but we always return home, to the land that sustains us. Never forget that." Tala listened closely, her heart full of pride. She knew that the traditions of her people were ancient, woven into the very fabric of the world around her. The boats that skimmed across the water, the acorns that fed her family, and the shells that traded hands, each was a piece of the story that had been passed down through countless generations. And as she lay beneath the stars that night, she felt the weight of those stories, the wisdom of her ancestors, and the promise of the land and sea. In her heart, she knew that the future would be shaped by the same rhythms that had governed the lives of her people for centuries. The land was not simply a place to live, it was a living, breathing entity. The boats, the shells, and the acorns were not just tools or commodities, they were symbols of the deep connection between the people and the world around them. And as long as that connection endured, so too would the people of California. Thus, the story of prehistoric California unfolds, where the seas and forests intertwined with the lives of the people, and where boats, shell money, and acorns formed the foundation of a culture that thrived for thousands of years, long before the world knew of their existence. Prehistoric California, Boats, Shell Money, and Acorns, Part 2. The following seasons brought new challenges and opportunities for the Chumash. With the passing of the equinox, the wind shifted, and the sea became more unpredictable. Yet Tala and her community did not fear the ocean. They respected it, recognizing its power and understanding its rhythms. For the Chumash, the water was a guide and a teacher. It was the source of life, just as the earth and the sky were, but it also demanded reverence. Tola's skills with the tomahawk had grown over the past seasons. She had learned not only to navigate by the stars, as her elders had, but also to read the currents and swells beneath the boat, to know when to head back to shore and when to push farther out into the vast blue unknown. It was said that the Channel Islands, especially the rugged and treacherous Santa Cruz Island, were filled with dangerous waters, but the Chumash had been sailing those waters for millennia, weaving their own map of the currents and winds. One particular day, Tala was preparing for another journey, her tomahawk finally crafted and ready. She had been chosen by her village to lead a group of young fishermen to the island, not only to gather abalone but also to exchange goods with other coastal tribes. The journey was not just about the hunt, it was an important rite of passage, a way for the young men to prove their worth and readiness for adulthood. Tola's leadership was vital. Her knowledge of the sea, and her ability to keep the young men focused and steady, would ensure that the journey would be successful. As the boats were prepared for departure, Tala stood at the shoreline, gazing out at the horizon. The sun had risen with a pale gold light, casting long shadows over the sand. She felt a deep sense of connection to her ancestors who had sailed these same waters, just as she would. Behind her, the village was quiet, the fires still warm, and the chatter of the families preparing for the day's work was distant, like the murmur of the wind itself. Her uncle, who had become a figurehead of wisdom in the community, approached her. He was older now, his back bent from years of labor, but his eyes still held the sharpness of a hawk. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "You will guide them well," he said, his voice a low rumble like the distant thunder of a storm. "But remember, the sea is not just a thing to conquer, it is a partner, and you must listen to it. If it calls you back, listen. If it offers gifts, take them humbly. The ocean is always speaking." Tala nodded, absorbing her uncle's words, knowing they carried weight beyond mere advice. The sea had its moods, calm and generous one moment, fierce and untamable the next. Over the centuries, the Chumash had learned that to live alongside the water, they had to understand its temperaments, just as they understood the earth and the sky. As the tomahawk slid into the surf, Tala felt the familiar lurch of the water against the hull beneath her. Her crew, a group of young men who had grown up alongside her, paddled in unison, each stroking rhythm with the pull of the tide. The shore grew distant, and the scent of seaweed and brine filled her senses. Their destination was the rocky shores of Santa Cruz, where the seaweed forests met the towering cliffs, a place where the deep waters gave birth to the finest abalone. The journey was calm at first, the boats gliding over the water like silent shadows. Tala felt the old connection to the sea, as though the waves themselves were guiding them, cradling them with gentle hands. But as they neared the island, the winds picked up, sending ripples across the surface. Tola's eyes narrowed, scanning the horizon. The clouds were thickening, and the wind had shifted in a way she did not expect. She called to her crew, urging them to tighten their pace. The others paddled harder, their faces set in concentration. Tala had learned the patterns of wind and weather, but sometimes the sea had a mind of its own, and she had learned not to challenge it. Suddenly, a gust of wind caught the sail of one of the other boats, tilting it dangerously. The young man in the boat panicked, struggling to right the craft. Without hesitation, Tala veered her tomahawk towards him, reaching out a hand to steady the boat. "Hold steady, Kalani," she shouted, her voice firm. "Use the rudder, not the paddles." Kalani, wide-eyed with fear, followed her instructions, pulling the rudder to correct the boat's course. Slowly, the tomahawk steadied itself, and the wind's fury seemed to subside. Tala breathed deeply, her pulse racing, but she was calm now. She knew the sea had tested them. This was a reminder that no matter how skilled one was, the ocean was unpredictable, and respect for its power was paramount. The group continued on, reaching the rocky shores of the island in the late afternoon. The winds had subsided, and the waters, though still choppy, were manageable. The young men began to dive for abalone, their movements swift and practiced, harvesting the precious shells from the underwater beds. As night fell and the boats were laden with shells, Tola's crew gathered around a small fire on the shore. The smell of roasting fish and seaweed filled the air, mingling with the scent of the salty breeze. The young men were jubilant, proud of their harvest and the journey they had completed. But Tala sat quietly, looking out over the water, her thoughts drifting. She felt a deep gratitude for the sea, the source of so much that sustained her people. The tomol, the fish, the abalone, and even the wind were all part of a larger cycle, one that her people had always understood. The ocean was not a hostile force to be feared, but a force to be revered, a teacher in patience and resilience. The next day, as they began their return journey to the mainland, Tala noticed something strange, a large flock of pelicans, diving and rising in perfect unison, their wings like the sails of the tomols. She knew then that the winds would carry them home swiftly. It was as though the ocean, in its infinite wisdom, had given its blessing. Back on the mainland, the village celebrated their safe return. The abalone shells were carefully traded, and the shell money, woven into intricate necklaces and belts, flowed through the hands of the traders. Tala had not only led the hunt and the exchange but had shown the young men what it meant to be true stewards of the land and sea. As she stood by the fire that evening, watching the flames flicker in the cool night air, she reflected on her journey. Her uncle's words rang in her ears once more. The ocean is always speaking, and now, Tala knew how to listen. The tamols, the shell money, the acorns, all these were gifts from the earth and sea, treasures that bound the Chumash to one another and to the natural world that sustained them. And as long as they remembered their place within this cycle, the stories of the sea, the boats, and the acorns would continue, pass from generation to generation, like the gentle rhythm of the waves that kiss the shore. Prehistoric California, Boats, Shell Money, and Acorns, Part 3. As the seasons shifted once again, bringing the hot, dry winds of late summer, Tola's village grew busier with preparations for the coming harvest and the winter rains. The acorn trees, which has been quiet for months, were beginning to show the first signs of ripening, their sturdy branches heavy with clusters of small, hard nuts. For the Chumash, the acorn harvest was one of the most sacred times of the year, a moment of both physical labor and spiritual reflection. It was not simply a matter of gathering food, it was a time of deep connection to the earth and to the ancestors who had taught them how to harvest and process the acorns in ways that honored the land. Tola's family, like many others, had a sacred grove of oak trees that they carefully tended. The oaks were not just a resource, they were part of the community's heritage, a living testament to the generations that had come before. Each year, the trees gave their acorns, but only to those who respected the land and followed the ancient practices of harvesting. Tala had learned the art of acorn gathering from her mother and her grandmother, and now it was her turn to pass on that knowledge to the younger girls of the village. She walked through the grove, feeling the texture of the leaves under her feet, her hand grazing the gnarled bark of the trees. The air was dry, carrying the faint smell of sagebrush and sun-baked earth. The branches of the oak trees were full of acorns, some ready to be plucked and others still small, their green shells only beginning to mature. She could feel the pulse of the trees, the slow rhythm of nature's cycle. Her cousin, Kimo, approached, holding a woven basket made from tule reeds. He had been working on the nearby river, fishing for salmon to preserve for the winter months, but today he had come to help with the acorn gathering. "The baskets are ready," he said, his voice full of warmth and a bit of humor. "I think we'll need a lot more before this is done." Tala smiled, her eyes softening as she looked at the sky, where the golden light of late afternoon poured through the oak leaves. "This year will be good, the trees are strong, and the rains were kind." The acorn harvest was always a communal effort, a time when families worked side by side, gathering the ripe acorns and then processing them. The women, especially, took on the task of leaching the bitter tannins from the acorns, a process that took several days, but it was well worth it. The end result was flour, a staple that could be stored and used for months, sustaining the community through the lean months of winter. As they gathered, Tala noticed the younger girls in the village beginning to join them. They were shy at first, hesitant to take on the task of climbing the trees and reaching the highest branches where the best acorns grew, but Tala knew it was part of their training. Soon, they would know the grove as well as she did. "Climb the trees carefully," Tala instructed one of the girls, a bright-eyed child named Ayla. "The best acorns grow near the top, but remember, always give thanks to the tree before you take." Ayla looked up at Tala, her eyes wide with curiosity and reverence. "Thank the tree?" she asked softly. Tala nodded. "Yes, When we take from the land, we must always give thanks. The trees give us what we need, but we must honor them in return. If we forget that, we lose the spirit of what makes us strong. As the sun set and the day's work came to an end, the village settled into a rhythm. The acorns were stored in woven baskets, and the women began the slow, labor-intensive process of grinding the nuts on large, flat stones. With the arrival of the first autumn rains, Tola's community would feast on acorn mush, a meal that connected them to the land and to each other, a dish that held the stories of ancestors long past. A few weeks later, as the leaves began to turn a rich shade of gold, Tola's role in the village had grown even more significant. She had not only led the journey to the Channel Islands but had become a skilled and respected leader, particularly when it came to matters of trade. Her knowledge of the sea, her leadership in the harvests, and her understanding of the cycles of the land had made her a figure of great importance. It was in this context that Tala received a visit from an emissary of the neighboring tribe, the Tongva, who lived in the region to the south. The Tongva had long been partners in trade with the Chumash, exchanging shells, fish, and rare materials, but tensions had been rising recently, partly due to the scarcity of resources caused by changing weather patterns and the growing competition for the most fertile fishing grounds. Tola's father, a wise and shrewd negotiator, had heard that the Tongva were seeking an audience, hoping to strengthen their trade relations. As a leader, Tala had been called upon to help navigate the delicate negotiations. The emissary arrived on a cool morning, his boat gliding smoothly to the shore. The men of the village stood by, watching carefully, but Tala knew that the true test of this meeting would lie in the balance of respect and diplomacy. When the emissary stepped onto the sand, he was tall and silent, his face carved in an expression of solemnity. He carried with him a bundle of finely woven baskets and several strings of shell money. Tala approached, her stance calm yet assertive. "Welcome, friend. What brings you to our shores?" The emissary nodded respectfully. "The winds are shifting," he said, his voice low but clear. "We seek to renew the bonds of trade that have long linked our peoples, but times are changing, the waters are unpredictable. The acorns, too, seem fewer than before. We need to understand if we can trust in one another's resources." Tala studied him for a moment, then nodded. "The land gives us what it can. We are caretakers, not owners. We do not take more than we need. But the sea," she gestured toward the endless horizon, "that is another matter. It is a place of both plenty and danger. If we are to trade, we must also respect it." The emissary agreed, and the conversation turned to trade goods. The Tongva sought shell beads, which were prized for their beauty, while the Chumash were in need of fresh fish and obsidian for making tools. Over the course of the afternoon, the negotiations grew more intense, but Tala remained calm, her experience guiding her through the delicate process. At last, an agreement was reached. Fish, obsidian, and other goods would be exchanged for shell beads and acorns, enough to help both tribes prepare for the coming months. But there was an unspoken understanding between them. This agreement was only temporary. The shifting weather and the unpredictable seas meant that what had worked for centuries might not work for much longer. That night, as Tala sat by the fire, watching the shadows dance in the flickering flames, she realized how fragile the balance between the land, sea, and people truly was. Her ancestors had always known that nothing was permanent, that every cycle of the seasons brought its own challenges, but it was this knowledge, this deep understanding of the natural world, that had allowed them to survive for so long. The acorns, the boats, the shell money, they were all pieces of a larger puzzle, a cycle that could only be sustained through respect, reciprocity, and a willingness to adapt. Tala closed her eyes and whispered a prayer to the land and sea, thanking them for their gifts. In return, she promised to guide the people in ways that honored their deep connection to the earth and waters. As long as they remembered their place within the world, she knew that the Chumash would continue to thrive, as they always had, on the shores of this ancient land. As the first autumn rains began to dot the dry earth, Tola's thoughts lingered on the emissary's words. The shifting winds and changing seasons were reminders that nothing stayed constant, not the weather, not the land, and not even the bonds between tribes. Tala knew that if the Chumash were to thrive, they would need to anticipate and adapt to the changes ahead. One morning, as the clouds loomed low and the village bustled with preparations for the rains, Tala gathered her closest advisors, her father, Chemo, and an elder named Naya, who was revered for her wisdom in interpreting the signs of the earth and sky. Together, they sat in the shade of a massive oak, its branches creaking softly in the wind. The emissary's visit was a warning. Tala began, her voice steady. The sea and land are no longer as predictable as they once were. The Tongva spoke of scarcity, but I sense it's more than that. What happens if the rains fail next year, or if the fish move to waters we cannot reach? Naya nodded slowly, her grey hair tumbling over her shoulders like rivers of silver. Your instincts are sharp, Tala. Our ancestors always taught us to observe the cycles of the world, but they also taught us to innovate when the cycles shift. Chemo, sitting cross-legged beside them, chimed in. We've relied on trade for generations, but maybe it's time to rethink how we work with the Tongva and others. Instead of competing for resources, we could combine efforts, fish together, harvest together. Tala considered this. The idea of collaboration went against the more traditional boundaries between tribes, but it held promise. It's a bold suggestion, she said, but one that could unite us in ways we've never tried before. If we shared knowledge and tools, perhaps we could all prosper. The elder smiled faintly. You think like a leader who sees beyond the horizon. That's what the people will need. Determined to explore this path, Tala called a village council that evening. Around the central fire, the community gathered, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. Tala spoke of the challenges they faced and the need for unity not only within their village but with their neighbors. Her words resonated deeply. The younger generation, eager for change, supported the idea of collaboration, while the elders expressed cautious optimism. It was decided that Tala would send a message to the Tongva, proposing a gathering of leaders from both tribes to discuss shared strategies for managing their resources. The following weeks were filled with preparation. Tala worked tirelessly, coordinating her village's contributions to the upcoming gathering. The women wove baskets filled with dried fish, acorn flour, and shell beads, while the men crafted tools and ornaments to present as gifts of goodwill. Tala also led a small group to map the surrounding land and sea, identifying areas where resources were abundant and where they were dwindling. This knowledge would be invaluable in the discussions to come. Finally, the day arrived. Tala and her delegation traveled south to the Tongva's territory, where a great clearing had been prepared for the meeting. It was a place of natural beauty, bordered by towering sycamores and a sparkling stream. Leaders from both tribes sat in a circle, their expressions ranging from wary to hopeful. The discussions were intense but respectful. The Tongva emissary, who had visited Tola's village weeks earlier, served as a mediator. The Chumash shared their idea of collaborative harvesting and fishing, while the Tongva proposed joint ceremonies to strengthen their bond and ensure mutual respect for the land and sea. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the two tribes had reached an agreement. They would share knowledge, tools, and labor to make the most of their resources. In return, they pledged to uphold traditions of gratitude and care for the earth, ensuring that future generations would inherit a thriving world. As Tala returned to her village, she felt a sense of accomplishment but also a deep awareness of the work still to come. The agreement with the Tongva was just the beginning. It was up to her people to honor their commitments and to remain adaptable in the face of uncertainty. That evening, Tala stood by the shore, the waves lapping gently at her feet. The stars shimmered above, reflecting in the dark waters. She whispered another prayer, not just of thanks, but of hope, for her people, for the Tongva, and for the enduring spirit of the land and sea that sustained them all. The path ahead would not be easy, but Tala knew that as long as they worked together and respected the cycles of nature, the Chumash would continue to thrive.